Well, hello there, imagination connoisseurs, and welcome to another Roadtrippin with RMB podcast. I'm your host, Mike Bodden, and you're listening to our podcast recorded on Friday, July 1st, 2022. We're glad you're here. As you know, Rob and I chat every weekday, or almost every weekday, while he's on the road to the studio to meet up with John Campea and the rest of the Campea crew as they record their programs, the John Campea Show, the Mailbag Show, all those other great programs on John Campea's YouTube channel. I highly recommend you go ahead and catch those when you have a chance, maybe after you listen to this podcast. But what Rob and I talk about on this podcast doesn't necessarily have to be about genre entertainment. You know, science fiction, fantasy, horror, all of those things that we love. Sometimes we go off into talking about the business of Hollywood and the business of entertainment, or we talk about all sorts of economics, history, politics, our own backgrounds, things like that. I don't know. It's fun, it's wild, and it goes very, very often off the road and onto another road trip. But it's a chance for us to spend some time with you, and we enjoy that because we're all imagination connoisseurs. We hope that you will join our online community at Post-Geek Singularity.com. That's where all imagination connoisseurs are welcome to come and read articles, contribute letters, stories, reviews, all sorts of things. We share that with the audience and with our crowd of friends and followers on social media, as well as on YouTube and via podcast. So today's show is an interesting little follow-up to yesterday's show. There are a few improvements. First off, the carpenter, who was continually interrupting yesterday's show, is not here today because of the weather here in the Midwest. So you have a relatively hammer-free episode of Roadtrippin today, so you're welcome for that. But also, Rob has a chance to wax a little poetically about the latest episode of For All Mankind, which is a show on Apple TV that he's a big fan of. I have not had a chance to watch it, but being a big NASA kid growing up and everything, and a big fan of the space program, it was an absolutely enjoyable conversation. I think you'll enjoy it. And of course, like all of our conversations with Rob, it starts with a phone call, or at least a dial tone.
Good morning, Mr. Bodden.
Oh, good morning, Rob. How are you today?
Oh, dude, I'm pretty elated going into this 4th of July weekend.
Really? Well, you've got to explain why. Why is that? Why are you...
I just watched episode 4 of season 3 of For All Mankind, which is by far my favorite show. I mean, we are blessed with an embarrassment of riches of genre programming, but For All Mankind is, for my dollar, the best science fiction being made today.
Well, that's encouraging. That's
also,
good news.
It's also, I mean, where, one of the creators, the great Ron Moore, who started his career in Star Trek and Battlestar Galactica, as he said, he's always thought of this show as what the precursor to the Star Trek universe that we know. And obviously it's an alternate history that begins in the 60s where the Soviet Union beats America to the moon.
Right.
And the show goes from there, and it has detailed in each season. The first season takes place in the 70s, the second season takes place in the 80s, and the season going now takes place in the 90s. And by now, it's about a three-way race to Mars, the red planet, by the Soviet Union, America, and Helios, which is a private SpaceX-like company presided over by an Elon Musk character.
Interesting.
And first of all, I've never seen an episode of TV where the final shot made me duck. Mike, I literally ducked. And what was so brilliant about this episode is it starts out kind of fun, and it's euphoric because you've got these 3 teams that are going to Mars. It's like watching the America's Cup. And they're all they're jockeying for position to see who's going to get to the red planet first. and all of the characters, all of the principal cast are involved.
Wow.
And it starts out going one way, and by the end, Mike, by the end of the episode, I was curled up in a fucking ball, and the final shot, I literally ducked, and it was one of those TV episodes where there's no music over the end credits.
Right. So it just kind of,
you know that something big has just gone down when that, like when there was a Game of Thrones episode where nothing was over the end credits.
Oh yeah.
Where they played the Reigns of Castamere.
Yeah.
You know, it was like, well, this was like that, and it reminded me of one of my favorite hours of television that I've ever seen, which was a first season ER episode directed by Mimi Leader called Love's Labor Lost. And it starts out, and it seems like this kind of happy episode where this couple goes in and a woman's going to give birth. She's very pregnant. And by the end of the episode, I was also curled up in a ball watching the episode through my fingers. And when it was over, my jaw I was slack-jawed looking at the screen, not believing what I'd just seen.
Right. It's one of those episodes where it's like the story about putting the frog in the pot of water and just turning up the heat, and it doesn't realize it's boiling to death until it's too late. But usually those episodes kind of start off, and they're engaging and interesting and fun, and just things logically progress to the point where when they go very bad at the end, they just the effect lingers with you, doesn't it? I mean, it just stays with you, and you keep obsessing about it and thinking about it. I mean, that's really,
Yeah, I mean, what's so brilliant about this show, and I know it's not for everybody, because if you're a genre, if you love science fiction, fantasy, horror, this show is firmly set in the real world.
Right.
And all of the space technology, this show is so unsung, but the technical advising, I don't know who's our technical advisors on it.
Right.
And, they've worked for NASA. All of the peril in this show is because of just what an inhospitable environment outer space is.
Right.
And all of this stuff, there's such a scientific accuracy in this, and everything that happens in this episode, I mean, there's human melodrama, and if you don't like the idea of scientists trying to, push the boundaries of science and what those people's families must be like, sometimes there's a few storylines that border on the melodramatic, where it's a little too much.
Right.
But they always pull it back. And because it's still a TV show, so they push the melodrama a little bit because they kind of have to.
Well, yeah.
To heighten the character drama, but they always pull it back. And the last 10-minute episode, not only was it suspenseful, but then something goes horribly awry, and I have to say, there is death involved, and there is perhaps one of the most horrible deaths I have ever seen depicted anywhere. And it's not because you see necessarily the gore of it all, it's just how it happens and what happens.
Right.
And it's the kind of death, I mean, it's so horrible. I literally yelped. Elizabeth and I were just sitting there going, oh! It was just, I mean, the violation, the egregious violation of the human body, like when somebody gets shot, we're all desensitized to that.
Right.
But when there is extreme violence committed to the human body, that is so far out of the realm of our experience, but we understand how horrific it is. That happens in this episode, and I was just, it's slow in coming.
Oh my!
And you're like, no! Oh, dude,
Well, I have to. I definitely have to watch it. You know, I'm a sucker for a good crunchy sci-fi story. So For All Mankind is my kind of.
It's so real. When I say sci-fi, it's like you're watching something. It's almost like a docudrama.
Right.
And you know what else goes unsung? The space effects in this film, whether they're on the surface of the moon or in space, they're fucking the best ever done. They're the best realistic space effects ever done for television, bar none. Nothing even comes close.
Well, it's interesting, you know, you mentioned that horrifying death, you know, that we are kind of desensitized to, you know, people getting shot and frankly, with all of the fantasy and stuff that we've seen on Game of Thrones and Lord of the Rings and everything, even getting, you know, chopped with hit with a sword or a battle axe or, you know, getting run through by a Viking or whatever. It's not maybe as impactful as it used to be, but I can tell you, dude, and it's going to be a big weekend for death apparently, because we are starting in on the final 2 episodes of Stranger Things, and I have not seen a horrific mutilation of the human body quite like what Vecna is doing to teenage kids in downstate Indiana, man. Well, Hawkins, Indiana is for some reason it is the center point of just really horrible limb breaking, limb snapping, body crunching, eye popping death. It's amazing. It's an incredible effect that they're doing. And I saw you on Campia yesterday. You were talking about this, and you know, we've got these 2 episodes that have now dropped. I've tried to avoid any kind of spoilers whatsoever. We're going to watch them this weekend so that I'm completely up to speed. But wow, has season 4 of Stranger Things been good?
Oh yeah, no, it's been really, really good. You know, I really love season 1. Season 2 I thought was kind of a rehash of season 1. Season 3 was kind of fun, but still rather improbable. But this season has been maybe the best season of the show. I mean, obviously it would need the setup that came before, but it's a truly the way that they've handled the ensemble and the writing. I mean, again, it all comes down to writing, and we are seeing some great genre writing on television these days. And it's really great. And you know, the writing on For All Mankind, the way they've balanced, I mean, the way they're playing with it's really interesting, because the way they lean into the effects, obviously these effects have to be incredibly expensive. So and the peril, the way they juxtapose the peril, I mean, especially with where the Soviet Union, they're the bad guys.
Right.
They're clearly the bad guys. Now, there are sympathetic Soviets, but this season has really leaned into, I wouldn't call them evil, but, you know, they kind of are. And they do such a good job of it. And the way one of our favorite characters, one of my favorite characters, is intertwined with the Soviets. I mean, she's going to have a day of reckoning, and it's not going to be pretty. And I would imagine that what has happened in this episode is going to precipitate the fallout. I mean, the plotting of this show, the way it's plotted out, and the way the story is laid out, the writing is very tightly focused. So by the time, you know, it's kind of like Game of Thrones. The last 2 episodes are always these big things. And like season 2, the final episode of season 2 is one of the best episodes of TV I've seen in 20 years. I can only imagine, like, they allowed critics to watch the first 8 episodes of For All Mankind, but they did not show them episodes 9 and 10.
Really?
And
that means something big is coming.
A good job. I mean, this show is so of today. It's so pertinent to what's going on now. I mean, my God, is it terrific.
Hey, talk for a minute about the importance, because you brought it up with Game of Thrones, and we've seen it happen time and time again, where there has to be a balance struck between good writing and great effects. Doesn't good writing, good plotting, a terrific lead-up make those effects have more impact and a greater effect on both the story and the audience when it's done right? Otherwise, you know, I mean, we've all seen cases time and again where, you know, bad effects can take a person out of a film, but good effects can't save a poorly crafted story.
Oh no, I agree. I mean, as a film editor myself, my rule, the Burnett rule, is you always cut away from a shot when the shot is no longer conveying information to the audience. Mm-hmm. And I think so often now, the spectacle of effects work is a crutch. Mm-hmm. And like, for instance, you know, if you see a vista of a beautiful city, like an establishing shot of a fantasy landscape, you know, if it's a CG shot, every frame costs money. You render a frame out and it costs money. So literally, if a shot is 5 seconds long, you can save a lot of money if you make that shot 4 seconds long or 3 seconds long.
Right.
A lot of the time, they want to linger on these shots. Well, to me, it's like, all you need to know, unless there's something happening inside the shot that is new, like something's happening over this vista, like you're seeing a gaggle of dragons approaching or something that's giving you information. As soon as you've taken the information in, within reason, you don't want to cut away too quickly either.
Right.
But then you're done. Then you continue the story. And what that does is all cinematic storytelling is pulling you along. And whether you're hearing dialogue, whether you're seeing glances between characters, whether you're seeing establishing shots that give way to location shots that tell you where the characters are, you should constantly be, and by the way, I think this is a very Western idea, mm-hmm. and I probably freely admit that, meaning that, like, I love Tarkovsky movies, and I love a lot of quiet foreign, I love Antonioni movies, and people might say, well, Rob, how can you say this when you like these movies where some directors linger on a shot for 5 minutes? It's a different kind of filmmaking.
Right.
You know, if I get to make more movies, I would not do that kind of filmmaking. I'm steeped in Western Hollywood filmmaking. You know, I mean, I think that's why I love David Fincher movies. David Fincher is a master of doing all kinds, using all forms. I mean, he can linger on a shot and he can cut things quickly.
Right.
He's a consummate filmmaker and really understands. Spielberg is the same way. Mm-hmm. So is Martin Scorsese. You know, these guys, we have very few masters really left that understand how to employ the cinematic language.
Right.
And unfortunately, because of hiring practices now in Hollywood, I don't see a lot of maestros coming out of today's talent pool.
Right.
Even the people I admire, like Robert Eggers, they gave him $100 or $90 million to make The Northman, and now his career is, you know, he might be in director jail for a while. I hope not, but maybe he is, because the movie didn't earn out. So you got to be careful. But yeah, to answer your question, I think too often they effects are used to, I mean, not to fall back on Star Trek, but I'll fall back on Star Trek. In the original Star Trek, they didn't have the budget to fall back on effect shots, so effects were used judiciously to tell the story. Right. Nowadays, they because they can linger on effect shots or let them last, and they're a substitute for real storytelling, I think, and that happens a lot on genre shows. Right.
Well, and that's not to say that it's a binary choice, right? It's not like either you move the story along or you show an effect shot. I mean, part of it too is how you lead into the effect shot and what you do with the effect shot to keep the momentum of the story moving forward.
That's right.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen it over and over again where it's like the effect shot, I guess, is okay, but it's like the story's come to a complete standstill now. It's like, and it doesn't necessarily even have to be an effect shot. It can be, you know, someone spending too much time, you know, on a two shot, and you're never really able to get in tight to see what's going on in the mind of the character who's got some business to do in order to be able to get to the next point to keep the plot moving forward. It really is an issue of not understanding the language of storytelling through cinema that
No.
that unfortunately, yeah, it's very frustrating, and that's not only reserved for big pictures. That's for any kind of film. You ought to understand that language and how to edit a film to be able to keep that conversation going.
Yeah, I mean, the death of independent cinema, I've worked on even independent movies where, it's someone's first time film and they don't have a real command of the language and they're shooting a lot of 50-50s on a 50 millimeter lens.
Yep.
And basically the way we see things, because cinema is about showing us the world the way we can't see it from our vantage point.
Right.
So if you're shooting it, but a lot of people don't, if you're not really aware of what you're doing, that's a common complaint. You don't shoot enough coverage, and the point is that you want to get, in my mind, if you want to become a great filmmaker, you learn how to get much closer and much further away than we normally see the world to make it work.
Right.
And that's because so many low-budget movies are hamstrung by the fact that they don't have enough coverage, and it looks too much like how we see the world. And that way lies death. But, the death of cinema.
Yeah, yeah.
The death of cinema is the 50 millimeter lens. I mean, that's not entirely true, but
right, but your point's well taken, and in fact, I think where you really see that, and this is not to cast aspersions on this particular type of film, but fan films made by fans about the things that they love by people who are not, necessarily people who've studied the craft of filmmaking, you do end up with a lot of very static, blocky action, poor direction, but it's not just like a cheesy performance or a silly looking prop or something that's the problem. The real problem is in kind of an inability to tell that story through the lens of the camera. And I tell people it's kind of like if you're a musician, it's like you learn a song, but you only sing it at one volume and at one tempo. And unless you know how to vary tempo to create mood, and unless you understand dynamics and performance, hearing one song at one volume at one tempo is not very interesting, no matter what kind of song it is. So, I mean, that's what separates the real filmmakers from the auteurs from the people that are just kind of like going through the motions. The difference between directing a TV show and directing the evening news.
I know it's true. But there's when I've only directed one film, and we were really, part of my problem is the film I made is very simply directed because we were shooting in so many different locations.
Right.
And we had to be very mindful of, we would do company moves like every day.
Right.
So my shots were, and it was mostly people's faces talking. So I designed sort of simple coverage. So I just wanted enough coverage where I could bounce in and out of scenes so I could get the pace up through editorial.
Right.
And there's a way to do that as well. But if I just let the shots run and do a lot of oneers, it would have been not as good.
Right.
So you do have to understand at scale what you're working with, and that's where all the pre-plan comes in.
Yes. Well, it's important.
And I just think that like a show For All Mankind, I really get the sense that the show is meticulously plotted out, and they really understand when they've broken their stories, where they're going, how they're going to get there, what are the ramifications of every episode on the various characters and the storyline, and it's really a brilliantly plotted show. It really is.
Right. Well, and Rob, wouldn't you guess? I mean, not that you wouldn't be able to find out. I imagine you probably could if you gave it some thought and called the right people. But don't you presume that they already kind of have the final arc figured out for where For All Mankind is going to end up? A season or two down the road.
Yeah, I do. I think they probably, I mean, you know, I know that Ron Moore has a deal with Disney and he's going to have to leave the show.
Right.
But I would imagine, I mean, you know, again, kudos to Apple. I'm just happy we have these 3 seasons, because if that's all we get, you know, a lot of TV shows now last 3 seasons. That's kind of the streaming model, and then they're done.
Right.
If that's all we get from this show, I'll be very happy with it.
Well, you know, part of that is that I guess you have to look at each season like a chapter or a volume, and realize that it does need to wind up somewhat satisfactorily, so that if you don't get renewed, people aren't, you know, bemoaning for years and years and years, you know, how, boy, they wish they could just have one more episode to be able to tie up all those loose ends. On the other hand, you do want to create some element of suspense going from season to season, because you want people to tune back in. I mean, my God, I can hardly wait to see the next season of Handmaid's Tale. I mean, it's like watching the news some days, but, but I'm looking forward to it, you know, and I think that Better Call Saul totally, you know, Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul totally understood that. Vince Gilligan and the other writers on that show understood how to do that, and they knew how to stick the landing, you know. So I think it'll be interesting. Do you think we'll see a season 4 of For All Mankind?
You know, I think so. Because obviously, you know, what I do love about it is Apple doesn't give a fuck,
right?
Like, about viewership. I mean, they do, but not really, because they have taken a different tact. They have so much money in their coffers that what they're trying to do, you watch all their shows, there's a level of quality and prestige to their programming that's what they're going for.
Well, you know, you and I
think,
yeah, you and I kind of talked about it before. It's almost like for Apple, and to a degree, I think Amazon. If I were sitting in there in the office there listening in, I would suspect, it wouldn't surprise me to hear more interest and value placed on critical reaction to their shows and critical acceptance of the shows and the quality, and looking at viewer numbers as almost a secondary consideration. Because in the case of Apple, and we talked about this, I won't belabor the point, but it's like the major difference I see between Apple TV and Netflix is that from a brand value standpoint, Apple has to produce high quality content and high quality shows, because you're not buying a computer from Netflix.
No, well, it's true, and what's really interesting is that in terms of what I find really interesting in terms of messaging, For All Mankind is delivering, in my mind, the greatest messaging of any show on TV. And when I mean that, if you want to talk about today and the younger generation leaning heavily into identity politics and all that, no one is doing better representation for people of color, LGBTQ, for STEM, women in STEM, than this show. All of these touchstones. I mean, it blows away, and it does so effortlessly, and you don't even know, you don't even realize until you stop and you think, oh, right. And then I mean, it blows Star Trek out of the water. And it just, there's no comparison. And you look at it, and the whole thing about For All Mankind is it's progressive, it's uplifting, but at the same time, it also is filled with common sense and an understanding of, I mean, I'm sure that it'll get criticized. I mean, to me, it's like the West Wing of science fiction. Right. In a way. And a lot of people now, there's a lot of critical backlash that I noticed online about the West Wing, and how a lot of people think the messaging of that show is terrible looking back from our perspective today. Like a friend of mine, Josh Olson, who's an Academy Award nominated screenwriter, he is not a fan of Aaron Sorkin, and he's been doing a podcast that's been taking apart the West Wing for years. But this, to me, like I would say, if somebody were to say to me, Rob, what are two essential television shows that sort of touch on your own worldview?
Mm-hmm.
I would say that there are two current, relatively modern shows. One is Friday Night Lights.
Okay.
And the other is For All Mankind. And I would say, if you want to know something about me personally, those two shows will give you an insight into what kind of a world, where's my worldview at?
Right.
And it'd be Friday Night Lights and For All Mankind. And if people would ask me why, I would say, I would hope that it would be self-evident in watching those programs. But basically, at the end of the day, it's about good people living up to their potential, facing the world and what the world throws at them with grace, honor, intelligence, and optimism.
Well,
if that makes any sense.
Bravo. No, I think that's great. I've never really given that kind of question much thought. So I am reluctant to to stake my claim on a couple of television shows. I really have to think about it because, man, I've watched a lot of TV.
Right. Well, I mean, a lot of people. I would say that I'm talking about shows that celebrate us today. I mean,
right.
Obviously, I love Twilight Zone. I mean, I think the Twilight Zone's probably the greatest television show that ever was.
Mm-hmm.
But, nowadays, that estimation is tempered because nobody would say that because it's become part of the pop culture zeitgeist. It's no longer surprising. It's a show that ran from 59 to 64.
Sure.
And it isn't like if someone said, well, I love The Sopranos. I'm like, I get it. I understand. No one who grew up in this day and age can ever look at the Twilight Zone and realize how great it really was. I mean,
right.
And that's something that is always frustrating to me is that I really wish if I could ask one thing of fandom, me, the fountainhead of fandom, if I could ask, Mr. Rourke, if I could ask one thing of fandom, it would be that when you watch something, try and also take into consideration the time in which that thing was made.
Absolutely.
And what it meant to the audiences of the day.
Right.
And I wish people would take that into consideration. And I'm saying I still die based on what they are. They have to be good. But it's like you have to understand when something like Frankenstein came out in the early 30s or King Kong came out in the early 30s, what it meant for an audience to see those things at the time they were made.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And I know that a lot of people are like, whenever I hear, oh, that movie's overrated, I'm like, I get it. But it makes me want to punch someone in the face.
But it's the same way. It's the same way, from a technical achievement standpoint, when Victor Fleming's Wizard of Oz came out in 1939, it absolutely it had an effect not unlike when Avatar came out in the theater. I mean, people kept going back just to see the use of color. I mean, it had never really been used that way before to such effect, No,
and it's you can't ask that of everybody. I mean, I understand. Right. It's very funny because I really think that when I was leaning into it last week, I'm going to be a gatekeeper. I really think that when people get mad, like when people get mad at me for actually taking a stand and being critical of something, that I feel that they are taking it personally. It's always they're taking my criticism personally. And all I'm interested in doing is trying to make people stop and think for a minute.
Right.
Just think about something in a different way.
Right.
And that's it. I mean, I'm not telling anybody they can't like something, and nor would I expect everybody to like the same things because everybody has a different experience in the world, and like, I'm a huge fan of the space program, and For All Mankind, all of its quote-unquote sci-fi action is steeped in real physics.
Right.
So if you don't have a rudimentary understanding of actual space flight, and like, for instance, the first episode of the 3rd season has a lot to do with gravity and what it means, 1G, 2G, 3G, 4G, and like, I've never thought watching a gravity indicator pass 4Gs on a space station would make me cringe, but it did.
Right.
You know, because you understand, and a lot of people are like, I don't get it, man. And I'm like, I get it, I understand. It's like, you know, why some people love crossbreeding orchids.
Yeah.
I know nothing about crossbreeding orchids, but I would say this. I sure would be interested in listening to somebody give a lecture on how to breed orchids and what makes breeding orchids, you know, the orchid thief, Susan Orleans, or whatever. I'm curious about the world.
Right.
And I think that's a better way to be than to not be curious about the world.
Well,
but,
sure.
you know, to be curious about the world requires people to have a certain level of personality and intelligence and understanding and a desire and to know more about the world. And a lot of people would say, what do I need to know about the world for? I've got my own problems right in front of me. Right.
By the same token, I think to inculcate an interest in being curious about the world and in learning things, there needs to be some sense of joy that you derive from finding out something new, of adding to that wealth of knowledge that you already have. And I take a look back at, you know, when the Apollo program was going great guns and we were sending people to the moon and that kind of thing in the late 60s and early 70s, you know, and you know this, as a kid growing up, there was a lot of interest in the science involved about being able to go to the moon and what kind of food you ate when you were in space and all of that kind of stuff. We had questions about that. We wanted to learn about that. We wanted to drink our Tang because that's what astronauts drank. We wanted to do all of these things in order to kind of actually be able to put our hands on a piece of the space program, be a piece of that history that was happening right in front of us. And that, I think, at least for me, totally contributed to my interest in science fiction and especially my appreciation for science fiction that's firmly grounded in science. It's why I like, you know, it's one of the reasons why I really enjoyed The Expanse, is that the physics that those ships were exhibiting in The Expanse was much more realistic than anything that we typically see, you know, on TV for a sci-fi program. And you know, the fact that they had to execute maneuvers halfway through their flight and begin their retro burn so far along. And I remember my wife saying to me, like, how come those ships are moving forward if their engines are firing the other direction? I'm going, like, they have to slow down. This is all part, this is how it would really work. You know, so it's not it's not like they can come to a screeching halt, you know, in orbit coming out of light speed like we see all the time.
No, I mean, if we were able to do that, you'd have to come out of light speed. It would take you months to decelerate before you could actually get into orbit around the planet that you're going to.
Right. So
and I love all of that.
Yeah.
And I just think that it's really interesting. I just love the fact that I can watch an episode of a show that I love, a franchise that I love, and it makes me furiously angry. And then the next day, I get a show like For All Mankind that is elating to me.
Right.
And everything that I would want Star Trek to be that it used to be that it isn't, I get somewhere else. And that's kind of cool. I mean, if people are like, well, Rob, if you don't like it, why do you watch it? Well, I actually like the comparing and the contrasting as well.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's value in that.
Well, and I think that there's something to be said, you know, and we've talked about this a little bit too, growing up with the original Star Trek series and then realizing that we weren't going to have Star Trek ever again come, by 1969, we'd all just kind of resigned ourselves to that fact. And we started learning more and more about what it took to make Star Trek. And that's what kindled an interest in me in movie making, filmmaking, television, and that eventually, for me anyway, led into commercial production. But so all of that kind of stuff is interesting, and it leads to wanting to be able to talk about how stories are developed and how stories are told and the use of effects and pacing and plotting for long story arcs and things like that, like we talk about.
Well, on that note, Mike, I must take my leave of you.
Oh, Rob, I can't believe it. I still have letters.
We'll get to them.
We will have to get to them sometime. Hey, my friend, thank you so much. It's great, as always, to spend some time on this road trip with you, and we will talk again soon.
All right, sir.
All right, buddy. Have a good day.
See you later.
Okay, we'll see you. Bye. And that will do it for today's road trip with Robert Meyer Burnett. This is Roadtrippin. It's a podcast production of Imagination Connoisseurs Unlimited, LLC, and it's transmitted throughout the Post-Geek Singularity from our studios located just underneath the launch pad at Cape Canaveral. You can find Roadtrippin on your favorite podcasting platform and on our website, postgeeksingularity.com. We also post links to our podcasts on all of our social media accounts. You'll find the PGS on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, Reddit, Tumblr, and Discord. You can access our Discord server by going to our website and clicking on any of the hundreds of links on that site that will take you to our online conversation. You can go ahead and go there. You can either sign up and become a part of our Discord community or not. Either way, you're welcome to and invited to participate in our discussion boards on dozens of topics, and we have hundreds of members that comment there frequently. We hope that you will add your voice to that. We also hope you'll add your voice to this show. All you have to do to send us a message is go to our website at postgeeksingularity.com, and there's a big red button on our website that says Send a Show a Letter. You click on that and you go to our message center online. You go to the drop-down menu, select the Roadtrippin podcast, type in your message, hit send, and in a matter of seconds, that message will magically appear in my in-basket. I'll give it a look, send it on to Rob, and then we'll talk about your message. We'll read your letter and respond on an upcoming podcast. Hey folks, it's been really great having you sticking with us through all of these road tripping podcasts. You know, this one is number 48. And I don't think if you'd told Rob and I 2 months ago that we were going to do 50 of these, I think we both would have laughed pretty heartily. I seriously didn't think we'd be able to make it, but it's been fun. And we have really enjoyed doing them, and the response from Imagination Connoisseurs out there has been terrific. So thank you so much for your ongoing support. Thanks for listening. Share it with some friends. Be part of a larger conversation. And we will see you next week. Have a great 4th of July weekend, everyone. So long.